All right, perfect. Here we go.
All right.
There we are. So I'll introduce both of you briefly because you both sort of operate in different circles. So though this will probably be a somewhat niche conversation and people will most likely come to it knowing who both of you are, but Jordan Hall, who is with us today, is a very capable thinker, interlocutor with John Vervaeke, Jonathan Pageau, people in that camp, and Dr. Patitsas is the author of The Ethics of Beauty, the interim dean at Hellenic College Holy Cross. I'm a student at Hellenic College and have the blessing to have met both of these men. And so I decided to reach out to both of them in the hopes of having them have a fruitful conversation, which we hope to do today. So, Jordan, if I can call you that, I wanted to start off just by asking, since you've been reading The Ethics of Beauty, if you have any questions that came to mind. I know that's kind of
No, it's impossible. That's actually not even in many cases that would be hard. In this case, it's actually impossible. So maybe the what I would do there is to say, we can either just jump in and that we will certainly spend the fullness of all possible time on any thread that we pull on with any real integrity. I'm certain of that. Or you can pick one of the questions that you so carefully cultivated and have that be the thread we pull on. My sense of things is that I certainly am endeavoring to the best of my ability to be guided by the Spirit in this conversation. And so I think if we continue to kind of move along those lines, we'll find our place where we need to be.
Sure. Okay. Well, I had added, and I not on the first draft that I sent you, but I added something. I just wanted you to lay out for myself. I read some of your Medium essays on the notion of civium and listened to you talk about it a little bit. I was hoping you could lay it out for Dr. Petitsis as well, and then have him respond. I think that would be fruitful, and then we can get into a little bit more of the
Okay.
granular afterwards.
So I guess first, I'm pretty sure, although I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that Dr. Patitsis owns responsibility for introducing me to the notion of beauty first, which you've heard me sort of blather on about over the past, well, I guess 3 weeks since I started reading the book. And I say that because it landed on me with perfect clarity. And so I'm completely converted to that sensibility. And what that implies in terms of how I go about proceeding in life and making sense of things is whatever, some degree of fitness, some degree of competence, FYI. So there's the part of what I would love to get out of this is just some deeper, how do you say it right, capacity to operate or navigate by means of the beauty first sensibility. So I wrote this particular essay before that metanoia. So it has some of the texture of what truth feels like or tastes like. But the particular essay that you're speaking of, I didn't want to write it. So I spent probably 5 years not writing it, but eventually it had to write itself. So I sort of let it take over my fingertips and write itself. And that was nice. It's sort of out of my system. But the basic idea was a while back, 2006, I was at the first conference I ever went to at the Santa Fe Institute, where Jeffrey West gave what I think was the first public lecture on the findings that were coming out of the group that he and Louis Betancourt and several other folks were doing on initially studying scaling laws. And he wrote a book called Scale About It. But as part of that, one of the things that came out of it was that he was specifically talking about the singular, which is to say unique and interesting, scaling that showed up in cities and didn't show up in other kinds of human endeavors. Like it doesn't show up in corporations. And it doesn't show up in natural environments like trees or parameciums or forests, but it does show up in cities, and it has a very different curve. So just as kind of a brief on the essay, the insight is that living systems are largely governed by scaling laws that have an asymptote to them. They as you double the mass of an animal, for example, you increase the metabolism by 0.85. So that an elephant has a vastly smaller ratio of metabolism to mass than, say, a mouse. And so it begins to asymptote. A blue whale even more so. In a forest, even more so. And this is true across a wide variety of different kinds of characteristics and across all the living systems that they could interact with, including, by the way, corporations. So as you double the number of employees in a corporation, you actually get a lower amount of productivity per person, which is super interesting. The cities don't behave that way. In fact, cities have an exponential curve. Cities, as you double the population, a variety of characteristics in the first half of the essay, most notably wealth per capita and innovation per capita, increases to the 1.15 or so. I think Jim corrected me on that, but this is directionally correct. Which means in principle, if you could continue to double, you would just keep getting that exponential growth in those characteristics. All right. So Jeffrey made that presentation, and I, being a young, at that time, successful tech entrepreneur, thought it through and said, well, there's a lot of implications to this. What are we going to do with that? And he, being a much wiser and academic, said, that's not my job. My job is to write about the stuff that I have really good data on. I don't really draw any conjectures out of that. So I'm more reckless, but that's part of my disposition. It's who I am. So I thought about it for a while and spent a lot of time interacting with the implications and consequences. And that was the essay. So what the essay came to was 2 points. And this, I think, interacts with the second to last chapter of your book. I think. If I've got the chapters wrong, I apologize, but I think that's right. One, that the thesis I was putting forward is that this dynamic, this fact of exponential growth along certain vectors, is largely responsible for why humanity has been pulled into cities and civilization. Yes. And to say, I would say civilization really is the embodiment or the structure that is ultimately centered on cities. For the past, 10 to 50,000 years, depending on your whatever archaeological conspiracy you like to attach yourself to, or I guess 5.5. And that this may be coming to an end. So this is the proposal I'm going to make, is that the period of city that we've been interacting with for this period of time, I think, is the adolescent period. So we went from a childhood period, there's the pre-civilization, the pre-civic, through the tumultuous adolescent period of the civic. And we're moving into something which is a mature period. And part of that maturity is the thesis that I propose, which I can't defend too rigorously, but a little bit of data has started to defend it, is that the thing that's going on in the city is a secondary consequence. The reason why it's showing up in cities is that up until recently, we couldn't do what we're doing right now unless our bodies were in the same space. So to bring our minds into relationship, to being able to have a conversation that was sharing something at this level, required that we also have our bodies in relationship. And so cities were a medium to enable human bodies to be in close enough communication that human communication networks could happen in what was it called, sneaker net, the old-fashioned style. And that a variety of different things have happened since then, including transportation that extends the nature of what it means for bodies to be able to be in relationship. You can drive the sphere of what it means to be able to go have coffee with somebody is much larger than if you have to walk. But most notably, the ephemeralization of embodiment and the separation of the body and the thing that allows us to be in communication. For the moment, I'll just say the mind, and I'm sure that's not entirely right. And the reason why that's meaningful, well, there's lots of reasons why that's meaningful, but one is if the yoking of those two things together has been the primary driver for why we've moved to the arc and process of city and the series of sort of developmental stages that occur. I spent a lot of time focusing, for example, on the London during the period of the invention of the police and public sanitation as what happens when the population increases, increasing innovation, but also increasing, say, pollution and crime, which also, by the way, are on exponentials as well as innovation and wealth, and how you have to create new structures to solve those problems that tend to be step functions. We're reaching the end of the ability to navigate the growth of population in physical cities with infrastructure that have step functions that deal with the negative consequences of that density, and entering into this new possibility of having the ability to offload, or let's say even properly place the communications element more and more and more, though never entirely, never even necessarily even more than a small amount, in the virtual, which has a different footing. And therefore that releases an entirely new dynamic where the human body is able to move into a kind of relationship that is much more healthy for the human body than cities tend to be. So that was the thesis in that essay. Now you can imagine that as I was reading through that particular chapter, of course, there's so many different things going on in the book that it's a lot. They also had trauma in the story. And Beauty First. I was chewing on that, like, in relationship to Jacob's point and the perspective on Greenwich Village and what happens when you bring people into particular country, and the notion of, I would call it just complexity and organic complexity, as I think was the language you were using, or the third kind of science. But how do we think about these things and these feedback loops and stuff like that? But as an overarching element, part of the thesis that I've been running for now a while is that there's an intrinsic secular life cycle built into the arc of cities that is sitting on top of another kind of dynamic that has been pushing through it, that is not in that same kind of dynamic. And so if you look at the arc of cities, you see something that looks like a secular cycle and something that looks like, let's say, something else for the moment. And we may be, the big movement that's happening in our moment in time is a new possibility that begins to have a much more solid foundation and takes advantage of all the things that we love about cities, but also really quite categorically evaporates the things that are dangerous about them. And this may be of the ilk of a new kind of like a thing post-civilization, to use a very secular language, but it'll feel like closer to the kingdom, to put it in a more sacred language. Was that, sorry if I was rambling a lot, but I was trying to compress something into a brief period of time.
That wasn't rambling. You said a secular, was it secular cycle? Is that what you said?
Yeah, yeah.
Or a secular arc, secular cycle. And what do you mean by secular in that context? Because I think that might be a tech term that I just don't know.
I'm referring to the word secular here, meaning things that are born, grow old, and die.
So mortal stuff.
Mortal, yeah.
I mean, I guess, to start with, West, and that's quite an insight and a beautiful discovery to have, to see that cities are not like anything else. And of course, that's for Jane Jacobs, that's the foundation of everything. That somehow what goes on there, one of her key phrases, cities invent and reinvent the rural world for their own purposes. In her 1968 book, The Economy of Cities, she starts with the argument that agriculture is city work transplanted to the countryside, that it's cities that invent farming. So just almost any kind of thing, tourism really is in a kind of a city work transplanted to the countryside somehow. It's, and I think, for me, the big thing is that when cities act in concert, they radiate forces that invent and reinvent the rural world very powerfully. I mean, that's also a Jane Jacobs idea in Cities and the Wealth of Nations. So she talks about 5 city forces that radiate out and redo the non-city world. My understanding is that what we mean by globalization is that now those city forces are so strong that any particular city relative to that meta city is non-city space. And that produces this kind of sense that no one is safe, no one is rooted. Some nameless global elites are making decisions. So, but that's a little bit off. My concern with sort of the decline of the city is that from a Greek Orthodox perspective, the Greek and the Orthodox, I want to From an Orthodox perspective, the problem that arises in Western Europe on the continent is that philosophy cannot no longer navigate the symbolic. And I promise this is relevant, and goes into one of two extremes, either an extreme nominalism or an extreme realism. The Anglo-American, island off to the west counters that with a kind of philosophical skepticism that's almost an empiricism that I think ultimately is more Byzantine. And but the idea that the city would no longer have a physical thing seems to me just part of the way that cities drive an extreme nominalism, that they tend to drive a kind of iconoclasm almost. Like they live in a representational world, or they invite us to live in a non-embodied world.
Mhm.
And to me, this seems, now throwing the Greek side of Greek Orthodox, like dangerously Greek in the sense of Platonic dualism. And as an Orthodox Christian, I am thinking that this Greek and Roman side, which have flourished in the West, are sorely lacking some Semitic anchor, some like sense that the bodily existence of things is an irreducible factor. And that's a kind of realism that counters, or at least as a counterweight to an excessive nominalism. And this is one other thing. Jacobs thought that historically cities had been people eaters, even though they were the pinnacle and they were where innovation happens, and they radiate these forces. They tend to rely on in-migration from rural areas.
Mm-hmm.
And I think maybe in the United States, cities were not people eaters from, I don't know, the invention of these great public sanitation systems, like you mentioned, until Roe v. Wade. That's it. And all of the rest of history, I think cities have been consistently, they consume people. And if we pass to the Civium and a non-physical, then that kind of consumption of the human person, I mean, we're seeing it already, right? The birth rates are falling so precipitously everywhere. And in particular in the Muslim world, that, for a while was like the anchor or something. Also in Africa, we will run out of people before we run out of, and then ultimately that nominalism, or that notion that place doesn't matter, it'll be just Wile E. Coyote. He'll just look down. He's standing off the cliff. He can't. How do you? I mean, other than this Huxley's Brave New World, and you create babies in a lab, by the millions.
Mm.
How does this modern trend deal with that?
Let's see.
And talk about rambling. Boy, I was all over the place. But
I liked it. I followed it. I felt like there was like you said, that this will be relevant. I feel like it is. So here's what I heard. One, I heard the notion of cities as people leaders. And when I hear the word people leaders, one of the things that comes to me is this beautiful combination that I have on the one hand from Tyson Yunkaporta and some other friends of mine from the Polynesian. So Tyson is speaking, I don't know if you've read his book, Sand Talk, but it's Complexity Indigenous, the Aboriginal sensibility and the complex system science sensibility tightly combined. And other friends of me from the Polynesian indigenous world. And then I have Father Stephen DeYoung and the beautiful presentation he actually gave at the Symbolic World Summit, where we talk about the notion of identity no longer, in fact, being a nominalist fabrication centered on a hypothetical soul that is a zero content, but rather is actually the field of relationality. And so it's this, for me, it's a turning sideways. Instead of like you as a person are somehow a isolated atomic thing, but rather you as a person are a meshwork of relationships. So when we say that cities are people leaders, one way of saying is that cities are clippers of relationships and or attenuators, meaning it replaces strong bonds with weak bonds. It replaces 10 strong bonds with 100 weak bonds, including like, instead of eating instead of breaking bread with people who you know very well, you're going to the pagoda shop and getting a lamb kufta, which is maybe tastier along one vector, or maybe more thrilling along one vector, but it doesn't have the relational context. And by the way, you can continue down that road. Instead of it being a lamb that was raised by a farmer who you know, it was a lamb that was imported from New Zealand on an airplane that was built by people you don't know, right? So this notion of a vastly increasing proliferation of increasingly ephemeralized relationality, which is then the ephemeralization of the person. So you're actually being corrupted or disrupted in your interiority of what it actually makes you a person, while increasingly concentrated in almost like a simulation of a person. So that's the nominalist piece, I would say. So I agree, by the way, that cities almost essentially are people eaters because they are yoking. This is maybe sort of separate the two principles. They don't want the people. They definitely don't want your body. What they want is some function that people provide. Wow, that's interesting. I just had a flash to the notion of de Young's notion of what were they called? The portions of the heavenly host that were actually given responsibility for the various nations and the various cities that ultimately fell.
Principalities.
Yes, yeah, the principalities. So the principalities don't want your personhood. They want some portion of you. In this case, for cities, what they want to do is they want to consume your creative capacities and perhaps put your hands to work. But the rest of you, ideally, they can throw away. Right? So they're converting people into pieces of their bodies in a certain way, and particularly the human mind. So the proposal that I'm making is actually that we radically, let me say, both prescriptively, i.e. that this is where we should go, but also predictively, that this is where we are going and will continue to go. Radically return to a lived, healthy, wholesome human person, which is to say strong relationships, tuned to the capacities that human beings naturally have to form strong relationships, i.e. children with grandmothers is the kind of relationship that human beings are naturally good at and need to have to be fully developed humans, not kindergartners only with kindergartners, for example. And with place. So having a relationship of care and intimacy with place. So relationship of care, a radically increased relationship of care and intimacy with other people, and a radical increase in the relationship of care and intimacy with place that can be afforded by the fact that we can, and by no means know how to do this well, but we can then also move the thing that cities have been tapping into, which is to say the communicative capacity of collaboration in the mental or in the virtual realm, in the virtual realm. And so we effectively separate out these two pieces, and we allow each of these two pieces to be in their proper location, and then, by the way, also in their proper relationship. This is why I talk about the notion of maturity versus adolescence. The city has been pulled forward and at the expense of the human element by this capability and this thing, which is just part of reality that was discovered, let's say, willy-nilly, and I'm just waving my hands on that, but pulled forward by this discovery highly unconsciously, and constantly just dealing with the problem at hand. And for example, in London, hey, there's human refuse everywhere, and our methods for dealing with it aren't working. Okay, you figure it out. And no real consideration of the implications of figuring it out. Just figure it out, and we'll work the rest out later, even if we think about that. So sort of proceeding forward in that fashion, more or less continuously. And even when they're trying to do it, and this is where Jake, I think, analysis of urban planning is spot on. Even to the degree to which there's something like an endeavor to plan properly, it's using a toolkit that is so radically inappropriate for the task at hand that it's, it is equivalent of medieval surgery. Or, I think it's actually in your book when we talked about medicine was actually not a net benefit until
1925 or something.
Exactly. So the moral equivalent, almost exactly, and maybe even actually not the moral equivalent, but an actual mapping from a mathematical level. So that's the prescription, and the hypothesis is that if we can do that, if we make that move, healthy human beings who understand, for example, how to navigate relationships because they're in relationships that require being able to navigate them over long periods of time. You can't just boot somebody because you will never see them again, but you actually have to figure out how to deal with conflict and deal with the difference in an embodied context. Well, that pays a huge dividend for how people will interact in a virtual context, because it's just sort of part of their character, not something that you have to think about. And I'm healthy also in all the different ways: physically healthy, emotionally healthy, mentally healthy, detoxified environments, like all the different elements that we work our way out of. Now, you described one element of the burning platform. Do you know the notion of a burning platform? So it came from, I believe, an oil rig fire. So you're in an oil rig in the middle of the ocean. Getting off that oil rig and getting into little boats in the ocean is a very bad idea. But if the oil rig's on fire, it's the better of two bad ideas. So a burning platform problem. I actually don't think there's even a burning platform problem, but most people will perceive it as such. That things like extinguishing birth rates for a variety of reasons, many, many reasons why our birth rates are plummeting. It's absurd, actually, how many, but and therefore almost impossible to pull up through engineering methodologies. But also just as, seeping, like my friend John Vervaeke, the creeping sense of the meaning crisis, which is to say nihilism and meaninglessness, creeping into so many aspects of people's experience and lives, and therefore decisions and choices. And fill in the blank, right? Many, many, many different things are reaching a point of crisis, which is to say a point of cannot continue in this way. And so that shift is a burning platform problem. We need to make some kind of shift. I'm proposing what that looks like, but I'm also noticing that particularly post-COVID, particularly when a vanguard, I'll use that language without being too worried about it, of people who could choose to live outside of the city because their economic livelihood was no longer yoked to being in the city, i.e. people who could work remotely, began to, in real numbers, the journey, again, not well-traveled journey, but the journey of finding places that they really preferred to live, while maintaining the other characteristics of their life, in other words, their livelihood, in the virtual realm. And so if I run some numbers, and I have a couple of different characteristics. So one is, what's the growth rate of that exodus? Exodus is actually really good symbolically, isn't it? Because actually that's exactly what we're talking about. Pharaoh, let my people go. The crossing of the Red Sea, of the psychological and physical constraints that have yoked people into a particular mode of living across what will definitely be a desert crossing, but perhaps into a land of milk and honey. What does it look like in terms of the rate of that streaming out of the Exodus? What does it look like as they begin to embody a higher quality attractor on the other side of it? In other words, the pioneers established something. I'm in a small town, for example, in the Western North Carolina. It's a really nice place. It's definitely a quality of life upgrade from any other place I've ever been by a lot, including all the stuff that's off the balance sheet. And now I am fully committed to figuring out how to make it a more wholesome place along characteristics that aren't more like cities, or like the characteristics of cities that I don't like, not a person eating place, but a person nurturing place that many people would prefer to be at. So as more and more pioneers land in places and begin to cultivate those places along this direction, as more consciousness arises of this is how you ought to behave. Don't import the stuff you're fleeing from. Enter into a period of, what's it called? Catechumen? Become catechized into rightness, so that you can begin to be a participant in a increasing wholesomeness of this new place, which then, of course, makes it more suitable and attractive to more people. So you get a number of different feedback loops, while the cities continue to degrade in all of the different legible ways. And there's many, many things that are going to continue to happen that make cities less and less plausible, frankly, for anybody who can leave. And of course, the ones who can leave, when they leave, the cities become even less capable. So collapsing function, mostly in the, well, what we call the first world. So Korea, Japan, and the West. China will follow, but slightly behind. And then the question of, can we continue to build more and more infrastructural capacity to actually do things like all the things that are currently done in city dynamics. And by the way, as you said, agriculture, like the way that the city produces a change in the transformation of the rural, and also say the industrial. So we'll have to find ways to actually shift those functions of life into a new style. But each one of these benefits from the super exponential consequence of what happens when human beings enter into collaborative relationships with each other. And let's say liturgically. I'll bring another word that I've now begun throwing about somewhat recklessly because it landed on me and is specifically in your work. Actually, I think Shmeimon put that in my head, so we'll blame him. But as people begin to be able to operate increasingly liturgically, the consequences of that, or the benefits of that, in literally in generativity, in the ability to do things, is so high that the magnitude of the change that we have to undergo is at least navigable. Right? So what I'm saying is I can roughly model the amount of work that needs to be done to make this transition occur. I can roughly model the amount of potential that gets unlocked when people begin to behave in a new way. I can say, okay, at least it's plausible. It's within the scope of what can be done. And I say, here's the fire over here, and it's getting hotter and hotter and hotter, and more people are being pushed the hard way into this new mode. But as they get pushed over here, if they can find their way properly into this new mode, it gets easier and easier and easier for people to connect and participate. And then you get this crossover. So.
I mean, I think for Jacobs, to say that cities are people eaters, it's talking about mortality, and but she certainly does recognize that people come into their own in the city, that it really is, there is the emergence of humanity in a city environment.
Mm-hmm.
That reminds me of Roy Rappaport's book, Ritual and Religion and the Making of Humanity, which I don't know well, but I, am nevertheless influenced by, and that somehow ritual and religion, and then especially then as those flower into the city, they generate what we think of as what it means to be human. So I think, I mean, don't you think that there is still going to be some advantage? Let's say I live in just the perfect, perfectly designed and infrastructured small town on the banks of the Ohio River, south of Marietta or something. It's just, I've escaped all the problems of the big city, but somehow there is some advantage still to being a New Yorker, and the amount of embodied surprise, embodied difference that the New Yorker has to bump up against, even embodied danger or embodied problems. And I think Jacobs thought that certainly cities involved lots of inefficiencies, and those inefficiencies would either be fuels for innovation, or that somehow they were just, a necessary cost of doing business. There was no, as she said, economic development cannot be done efficiently. So it's going to have these surprises, that come. I mean, I would still feel, I go to New York, even let's say 20 years ago, and let's say go to the observation deck of the Empire State Building, and I look below, and I feel like I'm seeing a decaying thing, like it's a decaying organism for sure. And yet, I do feel that a New Yorker is superior to me on many metrics, and and it's still a place that a person would aspire to get away from, no matter how amenable their smaller town was, to get there and try to make it in New York, or like, will that go away with the Civium, or is it the idea that there'll be certain people, certain elite, who are so good at negotiating this new, more virtual meta city, that those people will surpass the old New Yorker?
Yeah, I think so. So I think we need to do is sort of separate some pieces out.
But in terms of the way the city doesn't just eat people, but helps them emerge. And
Yeah.
And that's a beautiful idea that, that the city sort of take people apart to feed them into its organism. And speaking from a churchman's perspective too, I mean, I think what the church recognizes is order at fractal scale. That's what we call hierarchy.
Mm.
And so for us, the health of the city should not come at the destruction of the neighborhood, which should not come at the destruction of the city, the street neighborhood or the family or whatever, or the individual. The church is really hoping for health at every fractal scale. Um, Although accepting that, the nicest guy is still a sinner and still a problem.
Right, of
A
course.
danger to himself and others. The nicest person is still. But yeah, please go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah.
So let's see. Let me just very briefly just work backwards. So I agree, by the way. It's funny because I came to the notion of fractal scale and hierarchy from a completely different perspective, as far as I can tell. But I would just say the answer is yes. And one of the characteristics that I put on city is an imperial sensibility. So the city puts the lower fractal levels into service to it. So it doesn't just eat people, it also eats neighborhoods, to put it simply. And of course, it eats the rural. It converts the rural into the farm, which makes it it becomes simpler and decontextualized so that it can become very generative along a very narrow element, which is of concern to the city, not to the people who live there or the plants and animals that were there initially. And remember, the metaphor, I think adolescence is a really good metaphor, which is why I used it. We want adolescence as humans. Humans need to be adolescent. We just don't want sorry, I'm slipping, I'll slip into politics a little bit. Let's say a characteristic of the political bind we find ourselves in is that we've got a lot of old adolescents in charge of things and no adults. And the same thing is happening in the context of cities, meaning New York is a great place to be 18, 19, maybe to the mid 20s. Not such a good place to be a kid. In fact, I would say an affirmatively bad place to be a kid.
Every neighborhood, I mean, isn't that just different by borough and street? And is it really
Increasingly every neighborhood, although it varies continuously, but the cycle change is also so high that the ability to maintain continuity of a good place isn't long enough for it to last. So you end up having an experience of having something yanked out from underneath you. So let's say, for example, you were 3 in a Brooklyn neighborhood that was actually a really good place to be. By the time you're 7, that Brooklyn neighborhood is no longer a good place to be because the cycle is just much faster and indifferent to the pace of human. Right? The point is it's indifferent to the pace of humans. So you might find a snap into
I
it.
see your point, yeah.
Okay, so there's things that are appropriate to certain stages of human development where the cosmopolitan and the stranger, or the novel, and the pace, by the way, the pace matters a lot as a characteristic, are not just super salient. Right? We got to be careful of places that are exciting but not healthy. So they're not just super salient, but in fact match. Right? They're a good fit to what is constitutive of a healthy human. By the way, the cosmopolitan also enters to things like finding mates. You need to actually expand well beyond your Dunbar 3 or Dunbar 4 level to find a good mate. So moving into a larger density environment. And this, of course, is a role of the university up until, I guess, about the last generation played a big role in. Okay, so then the last piece is this notion of make it there or you'll make it anywhere. And I do think that goes away. I think it's actually largely already gone away, except for very small niches. So, for example, the actual song, right? To be a musician these days is not to be at Carnegie Hall. And that's an archaism. To be successful in TikTok, God save us all, or on YouTube, is what it means to have made it there in the music world these days. And to play at Carnegie Hall is a fun sort of nostalgia that you might participate in. And this is true across a larger and larger subset of human behaviors. In fact, I'm trying to think of the ones where this isn't true, that are of the set that cities are good at anyway. Obviously, parenting is not a city thing. It's a different kind of thing, but finance is a city thing, but finance is moving out of the cities like today. Design, also moving into the virtual. So now embodiment, architecture is a beautiful move, because what we'd like to do is we'd like to see architecture be locked into a loop that goes like this, where people who are attracted to architecture are find a way to first be in something like virtual mentorship. And then if that really is part of their calling, by the way, I'm going to get very deeply into the church side of this, truly part of their calling, right? Not the way that they are able to achieve competitive advantage in a market space, but actually it's why God created them in the first place, can then find themselves moved into a physical context. So think of it the equivalent of a university or a guild structure, where they can come into deep, immersed relationship with this possibility, and then move back into a human scale world with that competence in place, still connecting with these relational threads and probably moving through them on a periodic basis, but being able to receive from the virtual all of the innovative ideas, and therefore being able to build up architecture which is relevant to their context. And so it's very much this merger. So think about, say, modernism, or even like Bauhaus, and certainly brutalism, as this nominalist tendency all the way pegged over here. Right? And then think about purely indigenous vernaculars being way over here. The question is, okay, what happens if you bring these into relationship? And of course, since, say, our God is all about relationship, it's a good hint that that's the thing we're trying to do, is bring these things that are currently not in good relationship into true relationship, i.e. liturgy, work together into a communion that enables the hierarchy to be sound, right? And it holds it into its proper relationality. Yeah, so I think that was like what I perceived as the different pieces of it.
So is there room in your predictive and prescriptive vision of the city? I think about, some people will say that one of the virtues of capitalism, or the modern market economy, is that things that used to be reserved for royalty or the aristocracy or even kings and queens are now freely available to just average people. And one thing that kings and queens seem to like to do is, there's a winter palace, there's a summer palace. So in your vision, would you see like the successful, operator in this as someone who migrates, let's say, between, a New York for a season, a smaller town, like the one you're living in now, maybe something, much more remote for certain seasons of the year, and although that might, if those places are even left at some, imaginary future, 500 years from now, do you think that will be part of the development, that people will try to consciously put themselves in different degrees of embodiedness to, the messiness of being around huge numbers of other, unprogrammed individuals?
Yes, I think that, so that piece, the notion of, say, both cosmopolitanism and novelty are part of the good, and therefore irreducible. But I can't help but want to again go back to separation or distinction or discernment. Royalty, and say, we don't want the things that royalty had. We want the things that we need. That sometimes royalty had and we didn't have, but a lot of things royalty had, like too much rich food and too much incest, is actually quite to be avoided. That's important, because a large part of the middle class mentality, which is what capitalism ultimately developed into, was a Girardian imago, or an image of things just because the aristocracy had it is therefore desirable.
The lawn.
Yes, exactly. Why do we have a lawn? Well, the queen had a lawn, therefore it must be desirable. No. Queens had terrible ability to discern what was right. They just had a lot of wealth, and so they had things. So I would return to more of something like, what are the things that people actually really need, and how do we make sure those things are provided in a way which is best in the context of human natural needs? And so in this case, for example, if we put it forward in the future, this is going to have to be 500 years. Let's say, we'll take 100 years to make it kind of like just close enough that it feels challenging, but far enough away that it can kind of wave our hands a bit. You imagine a global network of dirigibles that float about in the skies quietly and at a slow pace, at a proper pace. So you're in some relationship with the land you're passing over, but you're moving over it much faster than a car. And sailboats, for example, that are navigating the oceans, but beautiful, like different, not throwback sailboats, but using sails, but operating at that speed and using things like satellites to be able to navigate weather and whatnot. And so we have a transportation system, a circulatory system for the world that are moving human beings around. And so you have access to all those sorts of elements. But now we've actually, if you think about the nature of how, if you, how do I say it right? The hierarchy or the hierarchy consuming, it's not even hierarchy consuming. What's the right way of putting it? Imperial is a pretty good one. Overly top down, something like that, or domineering. The domineering structure of cities is loosened. And so lots of things have actually begun to shift now in 100 years. Many, many different places. And lots of these places are healthy locales, but they're specialized. Like think about the Japanese towns that have a 1,000-year history of pottery, for example. And so you get on the nearest airship. Over a period of a month, you interact with the travelers and the vagabonds who are in this airship network, which is beautiful in and of itself, form relationships and friendships that way, and then end up in one of these Japanese pottery towns where you absorb that skill set for whatever reason. Maybe it's part of your calling, maybe it's just something that you've begun to be interested in. And of course, therefore, also drinking in a whole, right, not cosmopolitan, but a whole cultural sensibility, which can be different from yours in many ways, but also is going to resonate with yours in a lot of interesting ways as well. And then you can return back to your community, which you would likely want to, because at the end of the day, the richness of that context is very, very high. Unless, by the way, you're one of the 15% of people who should be vagabonding. Right? Some portion of the human typology has that as part of what they do. Like they're the bees of our ecology, as they zip from flower to flower. And some people will probably just stay grounded because they're the people who just want to be in the place, and that's what they care about.
You may know one thing that
Routine he's no longer beating up against things that are unconsciously just there. And he's actually beginning to find out what the parameters and edges of adulthood feels like for himself, so that he can then see his father from a distance and begin to understand how to love the person as a person, for example. But a 18-year-old man probably needs to go on an adventure. Right? He needs to go to a very different place, maybe a hard place, maybe some challenge, real challenge. It'd be nice to bring real challenge back too.
I had a question. It just slipped my mind. What was it? Do you think this Civium will be, well, I don't know if the question is easier or more difficult, or what the comparative, kind of axis is in the United States vis-a-vis Europe, in as much as an American who, say, detaches from one of these bigger cities and reinvents him or herself in that kind of embodied small town that you're foreseeing, exist and would become, much healthier and many more of them. Does that mean more in the American context, where you have a federal system of government and those people can now vote locally and kind of fight whatever big city forces are? I'm thinking, of the fact that one of Jane Jacobs' main ideas or insights, I mean, if it really was an insight, and I think it was, is that you only get one city per currency. That's for her an iron law of economics. And so in her Cities in the Wealth of Nations, she just takes the reader on a little tour of Western Europe at that time. There was still a West Germany. This was before communism collapsed. And she says, look, you look at a map of a place like Finland and you see lots of towns and cities and whatever. But in fact, there's only one city that matters economically, and that's Helsinki. And she said, and that's true for pretty much every European nation,
Yes.
including England, which has, and it's 65 million people, has a grand total of 2 cities that carry weight, Birmingham being the second. And so it seems like, and then you have these parliamentary systems of government, like everything does seem to adduce to the concentration of power in the capital, in that city. Whereas the people who want to get this country well organized, they hate the federal system, they hate the electoral college. And here you would be going to some place, in North Dakota or something, that would have just as many senators as New York, just as many senators as, and the people. So does that, how does politics come into this? Or maybe that's too big a question with the time we have left, but just have you thought about that, Europe versus America?
Yes, not as such, but I think we can do some fun stuff right now. And we can also throw in Asia, by the way. I suspect China will be one of the hardest for lots of reasons, not the least of which is just intrinsically imperial. And the Chinese is, the Middle Kingdom has been the Middle Kingdom for a long time. Okay. And I bring that up, for example, if you think about Germany, contemporary Germany is fundamentally a Prussian imperial construct, which is about 200 years old. Germany, if we go back 1,000 years in its sort of deeper DNA, is a very small number of different principalities and fiefdoms that are built around towns. It's important to keep that in mind. All right, so let me the reason why I say that is this. How do I say that? Order of magnitude of degree of change. And so if we're thinking about, let's say, a problem that weighs 100 pounds, my daughter is not going to be able to lift that problem up. I could lift it up, and a strong man could lift it up easily. So you have the order of magnitude of the difficulty, and you have the order of magnitude of the strength of addressing the difficulty. And for a lot of reasons we're not going to have time to get into, it is my very confirmed hypothesis that the order of magnitude of what is coming in terms of degree of change is very, very, very high in comparison with the things that would otherwise hold it back. Right? So it's kind of like a wrecking ball coming through a plate glass window. If you're standing out front of the plate glass window and you're trying to talk to the people inside and you're yelling, and it's thick enough that it holds back your voice, but then a 300-pound wrecking ball smashes into it, you notice that it wasn't that strong. So deep structures, like 1,000-year or 10,000-year structures, are the things that are ultimately going to be the ground as the temperature, let's say the temperature rises. And so Germany doesn't look like a Prussian structure anymore. It actually looks like something that Charlemagne would have familiarity with, or even more specifically, the Habsburgs and the Holy Roman Empire, Italy as well. France is interesting. So hold that, right? You've got that. And that, by the way, that magnitude change is coming through a variety of different vectors, many, many vectors, hundreds of vectors, some of which are economic, some of which are technological, some of which are demographic, like lots of things are going on that are putting tension on the structures of law and politics, and by the way, psychology and paradigmatic models that we've been using for the past couple hundred years. And then remember, the hypothesis is that it's a structural shift at the level of city. And the hypothesis is that city as a center is like the center of a vortex, where you can see things at the periphery are moving, but it's actually the dynamos in the center. And as that dynamo begins to slow down, the periphery is still moving, it no longer has its generator. And if there's another attractor that's spinning, let's say, the opposite direction, that is not yet strong, but it is still active, the generator is increasing in energy, then what's happening in between will look quite turbulent, because it still has the inertial energy here, but it has a new building energy here, and you'll start seeing more and more of the system become entrained by this new attractor, moving into complexity and language. So those are two big chunks. Right? So one chunk is to begin to consider what the traverse will look like. we have to start thinking about what are the deepest structures that are likely to be controlling and constraining what people do, and how do we then think about the more superficial structures, many of which may not be that superficial, like let's say the EU. But by hypothesis, for example, I think that the EU's days are quite limited, like not long, like a decade. And Germany, as we understand it, yeah, that's maybe more like a 20 to 50 year time frame, maybe quicker. It's hard to say. England's interesting, because Londinium was a central city well before England was in England. Okay, so that's a very central, organized place. So what its sort of default state looks like, and as that kind of things begin to settle, the one dynamic that I think is probably the most, if you go real deep, is kinship or family. And in my kinship, I don't necessarily mean strictly genetic family, but that the ability to be in really, really deep relationships of care and intimacy, but also strength. And so if you come into relationships that can't stand the pressures of this degree of change, then those aren't going to work. But those sets of relationships that simultaneously are deeply satisfying and very attractive, very beautiful, very alluring to humans, and also the kinds of relationships that show strength in being, then those will be the ones that will survive and they will attract. An interesting model, by the way, is to look at how medieval towns formed out of the collapse of the Roman Empire. This has had a lot of the same like seeding elements. Certain locations just happened to have a local density, i.e. they were, for whatever reason, many different reasons, they held, and then people fled to them because they were stable, and then they began to grow up.
But in your vision of the future, how will that collapse model be different than, because you're not hoping for collapse, you're hoping for progress, but something will collapse. What's the thing that's collapsing? Just these existing top-heavy, top-down cities that are
this is a question of big
and can't solve their problems.
This is a question of choice. In other words, in some sense, it's up to us, and maybe like us, but certainly us as a species. If we take a look at, say, the collapse of the French aristocracy, the collapse of the Russian aristocracy, and say the collapse of the British Empire, in all three cases, something collapsed, but what exactly collapsed was different and how it collapsed was different. And a big part of it actually comes to both the psychological, psychospiritual desire of the elites to prevent anything from happening and their ability to do so, their power. So in the case of England, the separation of these, I guess all of us are ragtag colonial rebels to some extent, although your folks probably came over a little later. But the Americans left the British Empire because the British Empire wasn't strong enough to keep them from leaving. And so it actually was a relatively minor perturbation. And the rest of the empire, of course, after World War II, fell apart with, frankly, very little struggle indeed. By comparison, the French aristocracy could top-down prevent change for a long time and chose to keep things frozen in an increasingly non-real way, i.e. separated from reality. So when it broke big and it broke ugly. So the prognosis is that a lot is going to collapse. I would say everything that we understand in terms of government, with a limited extent, is subject to real possibility of just going away. How and when is a bigger question, and how much goes with it. At the end of the day, we could do it like the American Revolution. Say, okay, we hold this truth to be self-evident. We're doing it differently over here. Or even better, right? Like maybe the Czech Velvet Revolution, which was really nice. That's a good way of doing it. Yeah, think about that. Think about the degree of change that happened in East Germany and Czechoslovakia in the late 80s, I suppose. Is that right? Yeah, maybe the early 90s. It's funny, I can't remember anymore. So a lot of change, like radical change in the nature of how they were governed and who they were and their economy, and notably, by the way, largely a restoration of a deeper substrate of who they were, like a deeper connection to the actual hierarchy of which they were part. But a big change, and not so a huge collapse, but not that traumatic. So a non-traumatic collapse is what we're looking for. We want to navigate the crisis with a minimum amount of trauma, but that's going to be up to us. It's not baked in as far as I can tell, although God's in charge of that, not me.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see, how the security aspect, the national security, and all the foreign entanglements that the U.S. props up, would factor in if there was some kind of a big change here. Uh, Joseph, were you about to say something?
Yeah, I had a notion I wanted to incorporate, which was just sort of backtracking a little bit, the notion of the holy. There are places I think that are holy, and often in the founding of cities, especially in the Christian tradition, we see there maybe is a hermit who lives on a hill or in a glen or something like that, and the place becomes sanctified. And after his death, he's buried there. Maybe a church is built there, and that church over a few centuries becomes larger and larger. It eventually becomes a cathedral, maybe like an episcopal throne or something. I was in Strasbourg for my honeymoon with my wife, and we went to a castle there, and it had been over the course of about 2 millennia. It had been initially the cell on top of a mountain of a Catholic bishop who had lived there in fasting and prayer for quite a long time, and and then it became a military garrison, interestingly. And as it was built up, it became more and more castle-like. But then it was taken over by the church again and became something of a mixture of like a
Mhm.
Catholic military garrison. But then this whole city erupted around it, and it's flourishing to this day. So I'm wondering, as far as like an imperative for or a reason for people to dwell in propinquity, I'm using that word because it implies proximity and closeness of belief or orientation. There's something about like to be in psychosomatic proximity to someone, like you can't actually worship together virtually. I don't think we've really seen this since the pandemic. Um, a lot of Orthodox churches have started streaming their services, but the participation is like completely, to use your language, like ephemeralized to the extent that it's not really like so much of the liturgy is about the incense and the shuffling of feet and making prostrations in concert. Um, and in my own life, I grew up in a small town, and I recently moved to Boston in order to be in proximity to people um, living, I guess I would almost say like an embodied philosophical life and community, which I found at Hellenic College. It's been very good. But there's something about that that couldn't have been communicated virtually. And indeed, like I still have some of that is mediated virtually to me, and it feels weak. So I'm wondering if this can maybe reinforce the city as something I know we're probably coming up on a period of terminating this conversation for the time being, but the liturgy as something that generates cities, but also Dr. Patitsas, use in your book, you talk about the city as being generated in such a way that it's the opposite of trauma. Um, and maybe this isn't something that's totally tenable as in our contemporary situation, but I'm curious about the more like doxological aspects of embodiment and liturgy.
Well, I would say, um, the city itself is a liturgy, and if that winds down, then woe to its inhabitants. It's get out while you can. And when you think of some images from Detroit and abandoned churches of such majesty, and now the
Mhm.
roofs have collapsed, and there's rubble, in the nave, and those churches will never, and presumably never, recover. So just the existence of a worshiping community does not guarantee. Um, Now it can help, but if it cannot sort of penetrate, um, if openness, the yeah, or companies that is the harder will fall. And Detroit has shown that. Um, and another city that's illustrative, I think, is Pittsburgh, because Jane Jacobs said already in 1968, she said, this was the first of the great American cities to decline. And here it just had this world-class preeminence in the early 1900s, and its production of this steel and all that. And it drew in, hordes and large numbers of Eastern Europeans, all of whom built magnificent cathedrals. I mean, Pittsburgh is a map of, 8 centuries of Roman Catholic Orthodox conflict in Eastern Europe, and all the different branches of Eastern Catholic and Eastern Orthodox that are presented there. But I think, again, it was almost like an overinvestment in that kind of liturgy presaged the neglect of the liturgy of the city itself, of the economic innovation and development that would keep the thing going. And so I'm not really answering your question about the holy, except I will say this: the fact that those churches are there could inspire someone to return, could inspire that person to stay. It seems like in the long history of Boston, that one of the things that anchored the Coolidge Corner neighborhood was the number of Jewish people who wanted to be able to walk to their synagogue on a Friday night, even if they were otherwise not particularly observant Jews. And that kept that neighborhood strong, and it has, and that strength endured and then has, has ramified up and down Harvard Avenue. So I think I just say it's a complex relationship between actual holiness and cityness. I mean, certainly I borrow this from, I think it's Brian Daley and his famous, presidential Naps address about St. Basil in the city, that somehow there is a special kind of city genesis that comes from the hermit, from the holy. And my postulate, that's why you enforce Avaton at Mount Athos. It won't be a desert. If anyone could live there, everyone would want to raise their kids, on Mount Athos, and it would crush it. But it's an interesting thing. I mean, my kingdom is not of this world. And somehow what we're hoping, though, as policymakers, I mean, I think, 400 years ago, they thought, the Christianity will make people, loyal subjects of the king, or maybe that was 800 years ago, maybe 400 years ago, it would make them frugal and industrious and entrepreneurial. I would say that maybe we're hoping that it will have some impact on their ability to continuously innovate, because without that, once the motor dies, I mean, the suffering multiplies, and it's really rough. It's really rough for whoever's left. Devil take the hindmost type of situation arises.
I was noticing that it felt a little bit like the distinction between beauty first and truth first fit in here in a certain way. And something like there's a natural tension between the holiness that is present and something like a profaneness that is also present. So if you think about Detroit or Pittsburgh or San Francisco, the description of why Detroit collapses in some sense very straightforward. If you look at it just sort of mathematically, the city dynamics transformed into corporation dynamics. It became a corporation.
The company town, yeah.
A set of corporations, and the logic, the cultural logic of corporation began to, and it has a continuous process as short-term golden age and long-term collapse. Right? So when something shifts, by the way, I think also when you shift from a beauty first approach to a truth first approach, you get a short-term burst of something that looks like beauty, actually, and it certainly looks like goodness, but you're now separating from the aliveness, and you're separating from a capacity to discern the aliveness and therefore continue to be in service relationships and now the holiness. And so eventually it's going to die. In fact, in some sense, it's already dead. You just don't see it yet.
You just don't see it yet. For Jacobs, that's the shift from development to efficiency.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And she does think that you always need both, but you always need both.
Mm-hmm. And in the right order, right? These things come in there's a relationship of hierarchy that is natural to these things as well, in my sense of things. I quite like, though, the notion of holiness, just thinking about that, because I've personally experienced, let's say, my guess is that every city ultimately has something like a monk's hut at its center, or some progenitor of that. And then the forces of the holy, or the forces of the sacred or profane, have been wrestling over that location for the entire duration of time. So two questions that would emerge for me in the context of, and by the way, I'll be using the hard C now. I've been using the soft C, so Civium, but I think Civium is more proper. Is seek the holy, you seek the holy, but notice whether or not it's where you're supposed to be. It's not necessarily your holy. And I found that in my own journey. I found many places that were clearly places where people were supposed to be, and in a sacred way, because it was attracting that and calling that forth. And I could perceive it and learn from it, but I wasn't supposed to be there. It wasn't my particular place. And so both are true. So what do you call it? Avoid the profane, avoid the desecration of the holy, seek the holy, cultivate, be in service to and support the holy, and being mindful of whether or not that's where you're supposed to be, because it can be very difficult these days. If you're like it's like the moth to a flame. It's you're looking for the moon, but the light bulb kind of seems like the moon because you're a moth. And many people get pulled into the wrong place, but that's also part of learning and recovering our capacity to actually do this thing properly.
Very good. Thank you. Are you guys up for maybe 2 more questions and then call it quits?
I think I'm up for like 15 more minutes because I'm gonna have to go to the airport.
Got it. Okay.
Go to San
Um,
Francisco.
yeah, let's try this then. So I was reflecting this morning a little bit after reading some of listening to Jordan, your conversation with Dr. Vivenki, and reading the city's liturgy. And it came to me, for me, a big part of coming to Christianity has been the notion that we can be Christians as a priesthood for the world, for the life of the world, and that liturgy is something that's integral to this. In the liturgy, the priest says we offer this sacrifice on behalf of all and for all. Many of the litany prayers in the litany are for the Civium. They're for people, they're for schools, for those serving the armed services, etc. And Jordan, in your conversation with Dr. Vivenki, we were talking a little bit about how you're starting from this place of the microcosm, I suppose, in your small town, your small church, um, enacting these civium ideas uh, while keeping in mind the more cosmological, like global Catholic impact of what you're doing. And Dr. Patitsas, you talk about in The Ethics of Beauty, how when you gave Jane Jacobs the icon of the Theotokos, her very Catholic reaction that this icon encapsulates the forces that hold back the tides of anti-liturgy really awakened you to, I think, that idea of being a priesthood for the nations. And this kind of brings in one of the other questions that I had prepared about soteriology being something that is communal and it points outward. That our sense of our I, our selfhood, what we identify ourselves with expands. Saint Sophrony Sakharov talks about how as one gets closer to Christ, they begin to identify with the destiny of the entire cosmos. It starts to be included in their perception of their own selfhood. So I'm curious how, if either of you have anything to say about how to live with this like Catholicity of heart. Jordan, and you're living in your small town and going to your small church in your very particular setting, how you, because obviously you were thinking about the impact of these ideas on China and Germany and things, and Dr. Patitsas, obviously you have a similar breadth to your vision, and how do you live that truthfully? And then also when I was thinking about this, it came to me sort of that there's already an ephemeralization to the relationships between churches. Um, at least in the Orthodox tradition, we have a lot of lineages that are really have a strong integrity, the Russian tradition, the Greek tradition, but they are in the communion of prayer, which is a kind of ephemeralization. It's not virtual, but I'm curious, and this sort of I don't know. Yeah, those were my starting points. I'm curious if either of you have anything to say.
Jordan, you want to take first crack at it? It's a hard one, so or maybe it's not for you. So
No, it is. It's big. So what I was noticing, this is funny. I feel like I'm like, well, what I was noticing was, okay, yeah. The notion of, let's say, the universal or the global. Okay, truth first. If you try to take that as a conceptual object, that's already off on the wrong step. This is actually where globalism gets wrong immediately. But if I flip it around, and you said the community of prayer, if I flip it around and say, well, and I don't mean this, I mean this fully earnestly, it's all already God's kingdom. So it's already a whole. That's not the question. The question is, how do we behave in relationship with that reality? That's a different kind of question, and also a different way of approaching. And I notice in myself a lot of my notions of what happens at a larger scale are notions. They're ideas, which is to say they're coming from mind or truth. And so it's a good salve for me right now to be just living. And by the way, largely learning. I'm not really, the instantiation of Civium is not me coming into a bunch of backwoods rubes and teaching them how to do stuff. Quite the opposite. I'm exactly the opposite. And I'm here learning from people who know how to do the things that my theory says are the right kinds of things, but this is in practice. So let's live it. And then where something comes up that seems like it might be an interesting way of thinking about it, it's actually coming from the middle. It's not coming from me. Right? It's coming from the quality of the relationship, always in dialogue, always in conversation, always showing up in the moment, if you understand. And so, and it's kind of weird to say because it sounds almost odd these days. I don't know how it shows up for y'all, but the way it works for me is just a continuous process of learning how to come more and more into intimate relationship with what the spirit is moving and playing that role as properly called as well as you can. God's going to take care of the larger story. That's the only way it ever could have been.
yeah, I think that sounds really right to me because Christopher Alexander in The Timeless Way of Building, he says, a plant is not made by gluing cells together with the tweezers or something. There's a generative process, and we have to give ourselves to that process, and we will have, effects at every scale without realizing it or sometimes realizing it. But the point is, the process is the thing to give our hearts to it. I think, what Jane Jacobs said, was that whatever is trying to destroy civilization, that icon is against it. And I think, that is a powerful thing, like you said. But I mean, it's good to keep in mind that somehow what saves the earthly city is a sense that there is a city to come. And that is what, destroyed Detroit, let's say, right? You can preach that in your churches, but if the corporate power, as Jordan said, just enlarges and engorges, and it does not believe in the city to come, it only believes in the eternity of its own state, then, Jacobs used that too. I mean, it's already dead. It just looks big. And it's so important in many areas of life. And it seems like now in the world of podcasting and social media that it's getting easier, that just because they're big doesn't mean they're alive. And that's especially true of cities, but it's the ability to keep an eye fixed on that next world that enables us speak truth and to and like Jordan said, it's not just beauty first, but it's the beauty for us, that, to follow that when everything is making fun of it or saying, well, that's not our definition of beauty, or to follow that. And that's what I love about the Civium vision, that lots of people would rediscover the value of those places and revitalize them, and just like you said, not, and be revitalized. But really, Christianity is very important. It's a very important force for civilization, right? It's not merely, I don't mean this in the way it was meant 100 years ago or something. Even if it weren't true, right? It still is the thing. And it is true, and that's why it's the thing. But without, within the algorithm, without some kind of scrambler like it, a reorienter like it, the system will just die. And thankfully it is true. And we, have, all this evidence, I think it's overwhelming evidence. St. Paul says, for here we have no lasting city, but we seek the one which is to come. Then he says, therefore, let us go to him outside the gates. And then everything else he counsels doing is liturgical, and really generates a new city. So the more you accept that here we have no lasting city, the more you're able to, in a vibrant way, generate awesome cities on this earth. And even if, as we mature spiritually, we have to be very careful. Let's think of the others, people coming to city for the first time, or children, or tourists, or whatever. They need it for their salvation, just a good city.
Mm.
And it's fantastic if through our self-sacrifice, that happens.
All right. I think we can call it there. I thank you both so much for your time.
Really nice, sir.
Yeah, you raised my comment about San Francisco. It sounds like I'm in a hurry to leave. I'm just a little worried about but I shouldn't be. I can pack
You
quickly.
gotta make it on your flight. It's okay. We'll call it part 1 of 3. What do you guys say? I'm kidding.
I'm quite available, but also very, very happy to just let things be what they need to be.
Yeah, this was beautiful.
I think part 1 of 3 sounds good to me. But
maybe we'll distribute it over.
We'll see how we feel differently,
Sure.
in a week or 2 or something.
Yeah. All right, that sounds good. I'll stop recording now.
Okay.